Okay, here we go. Suffering beings are numberless. I vow to liberate them all. Attachment and clinging is inexhaustible. I vow to release it all. The gates to truth are numberless. I vow to master them all. The way of awakening is unattainable. I vow to attain it all. These are known as the Bodhisattva vows, and they are said by hundreds of thousands of Buddhists. They often are said at the start of a seated meditation session or at a gathering, but also by individuals alone on their cushions, sitting before a candle or some incense. But they are absurd vows, aren't they? Why would anyone hold themselves to such high standards? It almost seems prideful or foolish and a recipe for failure and despair. But that is not how they are understood. They are not understood as rods with which to beat ourselves or others up if we fail. They are meant to be aspirations. They are meant to be ideals to conform ourselves to, goals to strive for, ways to look at ourselves and the world, ends of our actions that orient us and keep us on the way. Is it true that ideals such as these, seemingly unattainable, can inspire us? Let's think about another man, Howard Thurman, who was an African-American scholar and preacher and teacher of Martin Luther King Jr. He met Gandhi and brought Gandhi's thinking to America. He was a father of the civil rights movement and was known as its spiritual director. He wrote a book. The book was called, he actually wrote many books, but one of his most famous was called Jesus and the Disinherited. In that book, he says that for too long, we have turned Jesus into a religious figure. Now that kind of sounds a little strange, because isn't Jesus a religious figure? But what Thurman meant was that we have turned Jesus into an object. We have become members of a religion about Jesus, and we have forgotten the religion of Jesus. We have ignored what Jesus said to us, ignored how he told us to live in the world, and turned him into an otherworldly idol who will grant us our heart's desires if we just worship rightly. But recall Jesus' words from the gospel today. It's not about coming to the altar. It's about reconciliation. That is first, then come to the altar. For Thurman, right religion was not the message of Jesus. That was not the gospel. That was not the message of the prophets in whose line Jesus came. Rather, Jesus was one of the disinherited. He was a dispossessed Jew under the thumb of the Roman Empire, and he preached a message of liberation as one of the disinherited, as one of the dispossessed, to the dispossessed. So when Jesus tells us and his people to not fear, he meant it in a very specific way. He meant, don't give in to the fear of the Roman legion as it marches down the street, pushing everyone to the sides as they come. He understood the plight of his people, of those who live in situations of poverty and desperation, that they live in fear. Fear of violence and fear of loss. Fear born of vulnerability and disempowerment. What does that fear do? That fear isolates. That fear shapes our hearts and our eyes so that we see only through the goggles of fear, through the lens of fear. We see not our neighbor, but an enemy. We see not allies, but foes. We see not another human being, but an adversary. In the end, fear separates, isolates, and in fact disempowers, because the fearful will not be in solidarity with one another. Fear born of powerlessness is born of powerlessness, and fear perpetuates powerlessness. And so Jesus, said Thurman, taught us not to fear. He taught us not to fear in that very same Sermon on the Mount from which our gospel comes today. Do not fear, for you are a child of God. Cultivate an awareness that not a hair of your head is unaccounted for in God's attention. How powerful, Thurman thought, the faith in such a statement could be. It could overcome the timidity and isolation that fear drives us to. It could overcome powerlessness. It could overcome evil. Jesus, said Thurman, taught us not to lie. Today we heard it. Let your word mean yes, yes, or no, no. There's no need to go around swearing on this or that. Just speak the truth. It's not uncommon, said Thurman, for a person who is powerless and threatened to turn to deception to attain their desires, to protect themselves, and even to protect others. But Thurman is concerned that such deception, while it may preserve the physical life, slowly kills the soul. It turns people into hypocrites. It weakens them and reinforces their subservience to the powerful, who don't need to deceive. But integrity, honesty, sincerity, this puts the powerless one on the same level as the powerful. Now it is one to one. One person to another, one human being to another human being. Neither is above or below. How difficult such a counsel is from Thurman. Don't be afraid. Don't lie. But he goes further. Don't hate, for hate is death. Thurman knew that the experience of black Americans was justification enough for anger and even for hate. But he heard Jesus saying something more radical. It was not, Thurman said, that Jesus wasn't strong enough for hate. It wasn't that he wasn't strong enough for anger. It was that Jesus knew that hate destroyed the hated and the hater. Thurman said that hate made any kind of true connection to the hated impossible. The hater feels that the hated was no longer human. For sure, hate and anger could for a moment feel justified. It could make us feel righteous and empowered. It could make us even feel strong. But in just a passage hence, from in the gospel that we read today, just a little longer, Jesus will say to us, love our enemies. In the end, the fire of hate consumes us and turns to ash the soul of the one who hates. For it allows us to think and even do whatever we feel the hated deserve, even a beating unto death. We lose our souls in our hate. The victim and the victimizer dehumanized. How difficult such a counsel as this. How can we not be afraid? How could we insist that those who are victims not lie to survive? How can Thurman counsel that those who have been sorely oppressed not hate their oppressor? Can he really mean this? Now, Thurman was no wavering reed. He was not counseling weakness, but a different kind of strength. It was the strength to be fully human, to stand up and be fully alive. He counseled strength to not become that which you are trying to fight against. He counseled strength to be a child of God. And so let us end with Jesus, We talked about the Bodhisattva vows. We talked about Thurman's counsels. Now we must hear Jesus. These are not easy words to hear today. How can we never be angry? How can we never be lustful? How can we control our hearts in the way Jesus seems to demand of us? It's too much. So, for most of the history of the interpretation of these texts, exceptions have been made. There's a bad anger, and there's a good anger. Obviously, Jesus was talking about the bad anger. My anger is good. These teachings on desire, they either got completely turned into every sexual thought is bad, or Jesus must have meant something else, or maybe we should just ignore the whole thing and move on. But this morning, I would ask you to hear these words in a different light. Of course, you are not always able to control your anger all the time. Of course, you're not able to control your desire all the time. Just as Thurman knew that there were those who were oppressed were tempted to deceive to survive, or were tempted to hate because they were angry, or were tempted to fear because they were threatened. So the bodhisattvas, those bodhisattvas, they know that suffering is endless and attachment and clinging are boundless. But perhaps that's the point. Jesus is asking us to be better versions of ourselves and to strive to be better, to reshape our hearts, to not be so quick to absolve ourselves of our anger or our lust, but to be something more. To try again and again to be people of love, to strive to treat others not as obstacles or enemies or annoyances or objects of our desire, but as people like us on the path, on the way, trying as we are trying, failing as we are failing, and sometimes with God's grace succeeding as we will sometimes succeed. Maybe Jesus is asking us to strive every day to be people who are able to love across the fear that isolates us, across the anger that flares in us, across the lust that consumes us, across the selfishness that drives us. Today's gospel is not about despairing that we can never be what Jesus wants us to be. It's about striving to be more than we think we are capable of. Amen.